Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Sustainable Commodities podcast. I'm Barnaby Patchett, MD of 199, a comms and marketing agency working in sustainability. And with me
is Judith Murdoch from Murdoch Associates, and we work in forestry commodities.
Today we've got a very special guest, Neil Judd, co-founder of Proforest. Proforest is a global not-for-profit that works on the development and implementation of both sustainable production and sourcing of forest risk commodities like soy, sugar, palm oil, cocoa, beef and timber. We're going to be talking a lot about Neil's background and why and how he set up Proforest, and all things sort of sourcing sustainable commodities. Expect chat on EUDR, as always, deforestation and beyond, and some legislation.
So Neil,
Hi.
welcome. Really, really pleased to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
For our listeners, can you just tell us a little bit about your background and certainly about Proforest?
Sure. Well, Ruth Nussbaum and I set up Proforest 25 years ago, essentially. And we were basically answering a need that was very much alive in the forest sector at the time to be able to source timber and forest products more sustainably. And that was exactly the time when FSC was coming into its own, essentially. So certification was obviously part of the answer, but everyone was looking at a wider range of tools as well. But of course, that very quickly morphed into a much wider scope of work on all sorts of different agricultural commodities. So obviously beyond the forest sector. Firstly into palm oil, where 2002, 2003, everyone started to think much more actively about palm oil, obviously because of the forest impacts, etc. But then again, that spread into other commodities. And so, as you said, Barnaby, at the start, much wider scope of work now. And of course, as should be the case, everyone is thinking about sustainability of agricultural crops and commodities across the board. Scope of work has widened and deepened over those 25 years.
It's quite scary when you say 25 years, because I'm just trying to think when I first met you, and it must be, I don't know, 16, 17 years since I kind of met you. How do you think the industry has the whole deforestation thing? How do you think it's changed? Because FSC, thinking about it, just beginning, and certainly RSPO. I mean, what is your take on that? What are the major changes that you've seen?
Yeah, it's scary, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, obviously, and it's hard when when you're in the day to day to kind of zoom back out again and take that long view. But definitely, I mean, we've obviously made tons of progress, right? Everyone recognizes that responsible, sustainable sourcing has to be part of the game now. Everyone talks the right language, and certainly on deforestation, more in things like palm than in some other sectors, but certainly across the board to a large extent on deforestation, there's been a lot of progress. Clearly, many companies missed their 2020 targets, and now we're at 2025. But there's been, I think, a lot of progress if you take that whole time span. So you have to remember that, and you have to feel positive about that. And in other regards, we've seen progress slowly, and we've seen progress stall over time. But generally, I mean, I think if you take that whole time span, the picture is a positive one, I think.
Do you think that's reflected? Do you think that that's reflected in perceptions?
I think it is. I mean, it's obvious. It's obvious that things could have moved faster. And it's obvious that many companies could have done more. But you have to basically recognize the gains and then push for more, of course. So both things are true, that we have moved forward, but there's so much more to do. And many actors could have moved so much faster, without a doubt.
But looking back, it is an important thing, and we often and kind of forget it. The concept I like is the long-term miracles. You need to really look back to where you've come from to over time to see that impact. If you're in it day to day, or you're covering it day to day, I guess in the media, the temptation isn't to do that.
Indeed, yeah. And I mean, the way I always look at it is, for companies, it's about helping them and coercing them, encouraging them to internalize, the impacts of their supply chains. And, if you go back 25 years, that really wasn't on the table at all. So we have come a long way in recognition that they need to internalize the impacts of deforestation, for example, and factor that in. But now, we have to help them to understand that their scope has to be broader. And so obviously human rights has become much more of a focus in the last 10 years. And now we're starting to think more broadly about nature and the need for the private sector to internalize impact on nature more broadly as well.
So one question, deforestation is obviously a huge focus about EUDR, and we'll come back and talk about that. But do you now see that definitely not so much everything is delivered on deforestation, but there is huge focus. Not many major policies don't have deforestation in them, and obviously human rights. But you mentioned nature. Why is nature important, and how could that perhaps be included in people's policies?
Just to go back one step, Judith, on the deforestation. I mean, I think it is the case that many of the kind of household names, the consumer goods companies, have done a great job to a large extent on deforestation. But then if you do take a wider view and you look at things like Forest 500, etc., there are still an awful lot of companies across wider commodity supply chains who are doing very little actually. And so forest products and palm are definitely at the front of the game, but many of the other sectors, and I'm thinking particularly of beef and cattle, they've still got so much work to do. So we mustn't forget that. So it's a very varied picture, I suppose, as a summary. But nature, I mean, yeah, I think the problem with nature, which is a strange statement, but anyway, the problem with nature from a company's point of view is the drivers aren't quite there yet, in terms of why they should act why they should incorporate nature in their policies and in their actions. Unfortunately, it's starting to come, but it's definitely not the case. Basically the drivers for incorporating deforestation in company action are very clear now, from legislation all the way through to reputation and everything in between. But for nature itself, in a broader sense, I mean, obviously we are dependent on nature. All of us, we're in an ecological emergency. But making that kind of making the rubber hit the road in a company driver sense is still not quite there.
Is that a data issue to some degree in terms of a lot of the other sustainability metrics? I'm thinking carbon specifically, and therefore deforestation. You can break them down to a carbon element. You can have a nice bit of data on your KPI dashboard with carbon goes down. You can show it. With biodiversity, with nature, it's a bit more challenging and less mature. Is that one of the problems?
Yeah, it's definitely a factor. But I fully agree that. Yeah, I think, and coming alongside deforestation, as you say, the kind of greenhouse gas emissions reductions is the next big one, clearly. And yeah, as you say, relatively easy to represent that, to measure it, and to demonstrate progress. And so therefore it makes it attractive to include in MRV systems. Yeah, much harder to do that with nature. Clearly, there's no kind of single indicator, as you say. So yeah, much more work. But that's not the only reason. I think the drivers haven't been there in the way they have with carbon and greenhouse gases. So it's both, I think.
What drivers do you think need to be there before people adopt it? Before these companies adopt nature positive strategies?
I think it's starting to come at kind of the the intergovernmental level with the conventional biological diversity as COPs, etc., and the global biodiversity framework targets that are there, but they're still very, very high level. So that needs to happen, and clearly disclosure is often the first step, right? So companies are invited to disclose impacts and disclose progress, and so hopefully at EU level, unless there's more backsliding, if I can put it like that, on commitments, then that will start to come. So there are voluntary disclosures. They're already there to some extent on nature. Compliance-based disclosure is the next thing, and so we can, I think it's a well-worn kind of trajectory, and so that I think it's definitely coming in the next 5 to 10 years. It's just a question of how fast it moves.
That's one of the positives, isn't it? That we've already got we've seen how these things can be progressed. We've got the structures in place, and obviously your organization's been a big part of that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think understanding the kind of the process of basically making commitments, understanding baselines, and then talking about implementation over time. I mean, the basics of management systems are well understood, and they're kind of they're basically represented in the due diligence kind of approaches that we see, which are now captured in legislation. So I think it's the process is well understood.
And you mentioned EUDR, so we should perhaps touch on that.
I think you did, actually.
That doesn't surprise me.
I was trying not to.
Yeah. I mean, as we record this, everybody's still of the opinion it's going to go ahead, but there is a slim chance it doesn't. What do you? I mean, I guess the question is that I'm hearing so many stories now about smallholders been excluded. It's already there's already evidence out there. I was recently at the Indonesian embassy with a group of smallholder 9 women who came over to sort of almost plead, "Don't leave us out." But it's beyond EUDR, if you like. It's because they don't have internet connection. That was partly, the biggest problem. I mean, what's your overview of EUDR? What's your personal views of EUDR?
I mean, I think, of course, the overriding objective was a noble one, was a good one, in terms of, basically accounting for the EU's footprint in terms of deforestation. And of course, I don't think you'd find that many people that would have opposed that. I think that's all very good stuff, and we'd all support the kind of the overriding objective. It's just that they in terms of how they went about implementing that, operationalizing that, somebody was so badly advised to focus on traceability as the kind of the heart of that, and all that's led to in terms of the problems of tracing everything to plot and everything. The burdens involved, which are well documented, are just insane. So why they decided to focus on that and not just take a kind of a broader due diligence approach, making much more intelligent use of things like certification, essentially, and not just have to start from, you've got to map every farm and everyone's got to share that information and all the rest of it, which has led to the problems you just talked about with small growers. I think that's the problem, is the way they sought to operationalize the objective was just very, very ill-informed, in my view.
The technocratic approach to it, and the bureaucratic approach to it.
But it's not even technocratic because I agree. Theoretically, you're right, but of course, as we've seen, the techno kind of the systems haven't existed to basically make it possible anyway.
No.
So you'd argue it wasn't a very technocratic approach in that sense. Exactly. I just don't know. It's kind of easy in theory to make the link from the objectives to the idea of traceability, but and traceability is important, clearly, but to make that the kind of the absolute heart of the thing was a massive mistake, unfortunately, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting because palm oil for me is obviously a big area, and the palm oil guys look like they're ready to go. I don't think many will get left behind, but for sure, there's clear evidence that smallholders have been excluded. But one of the things, and he kind of touched on it about other commodities. Obviously, cattle's within that, and you've obviously within the EUDR, there's timber and there's rubber, etc. Is it a problem as well that things like areas such as grasslands have been not considered within this, particularly when you're considering soya? Again, do you think they should have thought beyond forests, or is that another stage coming, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, of course, we would all talk about conversion in the wider sense. I think if you're thinking about a progression, then it seems perfectly reasonable to make the case that you start with forests where there's a lot more data. And anyway, it's a much more kind of well understood pathway, basically. And you see that anyway with the way that companies are approaching this. They tend to start with deforestation, and then they broaden out their kind of aspiration to make it more about a wider conversion approach. But yeah, no, I think that to me, that's a sensible kind of progression. Is let's start with deforestation, and then we can broaden it into other vegetation types. That seems completely defensible and completely sensible as well. But yeah, you're right. You're right to say, Judith, that palm is probably relatively ready as a sector, but that's only because they have a couple of really good tools at their disposal, but also it means that a lot of those smaller farmers that you were talking about have effectively been excluded from those compliant supply chains anyway, which of course is a massive problem.
How do we get around that?
You mean for EUDR?
So, yeah, well, or knowing that EUDR is there, what's the solution to either bring them back into the supply chain, or is it to reward them outside the supply chain, such as mechanisms like credits?
Yeah, of course. I mean, what you're seeing anyways with EUDR is it's kind of leading to a bit of a segmentation of supply chains anyway, right? Where you have EUDR compliant volumes going to Europe, and then you have the rest essentially. And so, yeah, you can certainly say you can do all your smallholder work for volumes going outside Europe, but for things like cocoa and coffee, that's not really an option because it's fundamentally a smallholder crop anyway. Yeah, so I hope there's just a bit of sensible, collaboration and like understanding and meeting in the middle somewhere to make it viable. It's going to be messy, I think.
It already has been. I think you look at you're not the first guest, I have to say, Neil, who's come up with the everyone who we've ever spoken to has said, the intention was good, but good intentions don't make great legislation. I think this is probably the gold standard for that in terms of how it's gone wrong. What about, some people have suggested that we would a better way forward would be to move forward with palm, with it being ready, and then bring in the other commodities later. Would you support another delay?
I mean, there are different levels of approaching this. There's the sort of the practical considerations, but there are also the political considerations. And clearly, EUDR is one football or pawn in a wider game, right? Of political pushback. And so, I would be dismayed if there was another delay, to be honest, because I think it sends all the wrong messages from a kind of higher level perspective. So I really hope. I mean, clearly one of the options is basically to say, "Oh, we're not ready, and let's have another year's delay." But clearly, I think better to say we recognize the issues. Let's go a bit easy on kind of enforcement, for example. Everyone knows that that's the case, and let's work out the kind of practicalities over an initial 1 or 2 year period or something, so that the intent is still there, recognizing the practical challenges and giving people a bit more time to deal with them. Because there are these two levels. There's the practical challenge on the one hand, and there's the political kind of imperatives on the other. So I really hope that it doesn't get pushed further down the road.
No, and those political considerations, I think we're all living in a time of political pushback. We had a period where sustainability and making progress on these issues was a broad consensus of all the main political parties, and we're now seeing in Europe, in the US, and potentially in the UK soon enough, parties come to the fore that don't have that same imperative. What can we do about that, or how do we operate in that environment?
I think we just have to keep making the case. I think very clear communication is crucial, and also helping people to understand that these are not burdens. You get the old kind of red tape point made that these are just kind of burdens, but they're not. They are helping, sometimes in a very imperfect way, to make sure that we have a world that's fit for purpose and fit for our children and grandchildren going forward. I mean, that's basically what we're talking about. Sometimes it's being done very clumsily, as we've just been talking about in the EUDR sense. But making the case very clearly and concisely that this is why we're doing these things, and this is how it's important to all of us. I really don't think there's enough of that. We're always talking about trying to minimize burdens and stuff, which is fine from a practical point of view, of course. And we've just been talking about the EUDR as a great example of that. But also making the positive case, I think is more important.
It's hard to think in long term. I think that's one of the challenges we face from a perspective is in lots of different areas, whether it's the corporates looking at their next quarter, whether it's the politicians thinking at the next election cycle. But, we need to be thinking in terms of the next 10, 20, 50 years. And I think that's one of the challenges we're really struggling with. And organizations like yours are the ones who can help us do that.
Yeah, fully agree. And I was just talking about nature just now, and probably if you talk to a range of like corporate representatives, they'd all agree that over a 10-year period, yes, absolutely, we need to be doing these things. But giving them the signals to kind of act this year or next year is crucial, because that's what kicks things off, and that's where we're lacking is those shorter term signals that make it an imperative for them. But yeah, you're right. Is that there is a big clash of timescale here.
So what are you doing at Proforest at the moment then what are your big priorities in terms of progressing this agenda and progressing things, making things better in a practical sense?
Yeah, I think firstly, the deforestation agenda through to 2025 has been a major focus, because obviously most of the major kind of food sector corporates have had a 2025 target, and so that has been a major focus. And I think they'll, given the kind of the caveats we've just been talking about, there will be a fair degree of success there, to report kind of honestly about where targets have been hit and where they've been missed. So that remains a major focus in the short term. Clearly, human rights would be the second, and yeah, there's much more recognition, as I said, about internalizing human rights issues within, the responsibilities of a company in the supply chain through things like human rights due diligence. Essentially, that is now much more widely understood in terms of its practical components. So that should be captured in some of the legal frameworks, going forward in the short to medium term as well. And then, as I said, for me, the big gap and the one that we need to focus on over the next 5 years is bringing nature into that equation more widely. And that's a medium term kind of piece of work, is helping companies to understand what that looks like, and helping them to kind of find the drivers as well.
So when we look at nature, some of the things that we've been talking about recently is regenerative agriculture. How does nature fit into regenerative agriculture as a theme and a driver behind some of the businesses that I'm working with?
Yeah, I think regen ag. I mean, regen ag is really helpful because, well, it basically it helps to deliver on climate objectives very much, but also has a much wider kind of nature set of outcomes as well. And also, it's very much in a farmer and in a company and supply chain's self-interest to promote regen ag for all sorts of reasons, because yeah, not least because of the climate driver as well, and also often a cost driver. Cost of inputs clearly can be reduced. There's the whole yield part of the equation then that comes into play, but yeah, regen ag, as you just indicated, Judith, is huge. Clearly, it's very sector specific, and so if you're in the kind of annual crops business, regen ag looks very different to if you're dealing with a perennial like cocoa or palm or something, where the issues are different and the potential benefits are different as well. But yeah, I think hugely exciting, and actually, probably regen ag is the single most kind of tangible way of entry point for getting into the nature space as well, probably, because often it's very much aligned clearly with nature-based outputs.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, speaking to lots of people in the regenerative agriculture space at a recent summit, that was the consensus there. I guess one of the things, the broadness of the church is one of the benefits, both in terms of what you can do in terms of implementing processes, which allows lots of different people to do lots of different things, so that you don't have to have this one approach, you can measure the outcomes. But also in its political palatability. I think regenerative agriculture is almost alone in the sustainability space, in that it hasn't become ideologically poisoned in the same way, or ideologically not poisoned, divisive in the same way as carbon. So I'm hoping, my hope is that the corporates, therefore, it's more palatable to them to both do and talk about.
Isn't it interesting that we can think that climate change could be divisive? I mean, I find that extraordinary.
Me too. It didn't need to
yeah.
be that way, but it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
We have to be realistic.
I still can't figure out why that is. But anyway, yes, clearly we need to make the case. I'm still trying to understand why that's the case. But yeah, you're right. I think regen ag, I mean, it's kind of flexibility is definitely a massive strength. It's also a bit of a cautionary point as well, clearly, because the danger there would be, the concept can be diluted kind of beyond recognition. And so we have to be careful about that. And, if everyone's looking to claim that 100% of their inputs are regen ag based, then you can imagine people might be tempted to cut corners. But
like the UN SDGs, they're so broad that you could be doing, there's a temptation to do very little, but you can probably find something somewhere that supports one of the principles and therefore claim that you're supporting the SDGs. You think that there's a similar risk with regen ag?
Oh, there definitely is. But I think it's also a strength that there's a lot of flexibility in the concept, because there has to be, from sector to sector. So clearly there are people, lots of people maybe working on bringing a bit of kind of clarity to the concept, and that's to be welcomed, I think, as long as it doesn't become too straitjacketed at any point.
And what do you think about certification for regen agriculture? Would that help?
Could do. I mean, certification, as you know well, Judith, I mean, clearly has its strengths and its weaknesses as well, like most things, right? If you're looking for some more assurance, then it may well be the way to go in some cases. But on the other hand, could potentially lead to too much emphasis on quite narrow interpretations. And then, of course, you get into the whole business of the costs of certification as well, which is a real turn-off for some people, understandably, and particularly for small farmers. just noticed actually that I think Rainforest Alliance have just launched a Regen Ag standard in the last week or two, maybe.
We spoke about it on the podcast a couple of months ago
Okay, yes.
with Santiago
Yeah.
Gallan. Please listen to that episode for more on that standard.
I will. Yes, and exactly. So clearly, I think the summary would be there's definitely a place for it,
Mhm.
but probably there's also a place for being more flexible in a lot of cases. Yeah, it really depends what the drivers are.
Yeah, and I guess that it straight away jumps out when we talk about certification that particularly in palm oil, the principles and criteria are mandatory for growers, whether whether you be a smallholder or whether you be a large plantation. And that leads me on to shared responsibility. It was interesting to me in a recent study that I did about smallholders that smallholders appear to be not included in many supply chains. So my question to you is on things such as deforestation, nature, and human rights, when you actually look at uh, downstream players beyond, if you like, the big players such as say Nestle and Mars, do you think there is enough of this shared responsibility within fairly large companies? What's your view?
You mean in terms of downstream players taking their fair share of responsibility alongside the growers themselves? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's probably fair. In that, obviously when you talk about responsible, sustainable agriculture, you're basically talking typically about what happens at the farm, right?
Mhm.
And so, definitely that's the case. And making sure that a farmer's efforts are rewarded in the marketplace is obviously, I mean, to use that word again, it can get messy, right, in terms of deciding what's fair. But clearly, I think, in most cases, in most sectors, you could definitely make the case that there hasn't been enough uptake of, for example, responsible or certified, however you phrase it, product in that sector. Yeah, definitely. And one element of that, you were mentioning smallholders, would be direct support or indirect support to small growers. And one of the other buzz phrases clearly at the moment is just transition, right? And to me, that's basically making sure that no one loses out from the transitions that we need to make to a sustainable future, basically. So if you're asking smaller farmers to do things differently, you have to support them. Or the fair thing to do, the reasonable thing to do, would be to support them to make that transition. And then you need inputs from the whole supply chain to do that, I think. So yeah, it's a complex area clearly, but organizations like RSPO are well placed to kind of help whole sectors to share responsibility, and I think they have been making efforts to do that, haven't they?
But ultimately, it comes back to finance, doesn't it? Really, it's who's willing to pay. When we talk, we kind of skirt around the issue a lot of the times, and we talk about things like shared responsibility and farmer first, and these kind of words. But ultimately, it's right. Are you going to pay them more to do it? Are you going to help them pay for these projects? And finance has become, I guess, in our current climate, it's harder to access, and it's and people are less willing to lend. How do we get over that?
No, I think that the first piece you were talking about there, basically, if you are looking to produce any agricultural kind of commodity in a sustainable way, where the environment is protected, where soils and water are protected, where people are protected, and where farmers are paid properly, inevitably that costs more.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess that brings me back to what I was saying about internalizing costs. I mean, those are the costs that were externalized previously. And if we're serious about wanting to make that transition, then someone has to pay. I mean, there are huge issues there around the price of food, for example, because that's where it leads to, is the price of food. And that's a very political topic. And you could argue then that you have to talk about poverty, for example. So that's probably outside the scope of this podcast. But yeah, no, I think you're right, of course, that willingness to pay, whether that's in terms of farmer incomes, livelihoods, or higher environmental standards, has to be part of the equation. Absolutely. But then, there are the other elements of finance from lenders, from multilateral organizations, which are also part of the picture. Looking at the COP in November, COP 30, I think it is, right?
Yep.
Finance for keeping forests standing is a big, there's a big strand on that, rightly. And finally, we've got to that point where recognition that if you want, in producing countries, to put it crudely, forests to be retained and to be attractive in their own right, then someone has to pay. You have to value, and that also then extends to nature, of course.
Paying people not to farm is the kind of, if I'm sort of playing devil's advocate in a food price crisis, the pushback is going to be, you're paying people not to farm, and that's going to impact it. I think that's a challenge that we need to overcome, but it's providing that value to nature itself in terms of a resource is one of the challenges we all face, I think.
Yeah, and it's basically just about recognizing different types of value. It's if a farmer has an area of land that he or she's farming, and an area of land that's, for example, under forest, they should both be worth something in the marketplace in an ideal world, and both of those should be paid for. So that's the equation we're looking at, and we all need both of those things. We all need food, and we all need an environment that can take us into the future. So we should all be prepared to pay for both of those, essentially. So that's that. But these are complex, political, nuanced discussions, and they don't really lend themselves to sound bites all the time.
Hard to cover in a 40-minute conversation. Absolutely. It's really hard to solve all of the world's problems in sustainable commodities. They will give it a good go from time to time. Looking at the future, you mentioned the future there. What does it look like?
You asking me on a good day or a bad day?
Well, no, I think that's a really good answer in itself.
Well, I mean, I think that there could be a hard landing where we all learn these lessons in a very sort of not catastrophic, but a fairly traumatic way, that we need to take account of all the kind of values we've been talking about in the last 30-40 minutes, or we could learn them more quickly in a more ordered way, and therefore have a much softer landing to a future that looks much better, where people are paid properly for their produce, where nature is accommodated in the landscape in the way that we all want to see, and that we all have kind of a healthy diet and everything else, because it all fits together. I mean, basically, if you zoom out fully, then we're talking about food systems, basically. And there are lots of people thinking about that now. So I think that's the way to see it in the more holistic sense. I hope, and I just about still believe, that we can get there, because I think there's plenty of room for all of this. If we're careful and we can navigate our way through it properly, then there's plenty of room for really good, healthy, abundant food, plus nature, plus people being looked after in the way that we all want.
Well, that sounds like a very nice place to end that. And I know that you'll be working hard to make that happen at Proforest.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us on the Sustainable Commodities podcast. Where can people go to find out more about Proforest and the work that you do?
Basically, just head to the Proforest website. There's also often you'll see the Proforest briefing notes, etc., popping up on LinkedIn. So those two places are the place to start.
Great. Thank you very much. And join us again next time.
Thanks very much
indeed.
Bye-bye.